This podcast is presented by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
Hi, I'm Kelsey.
I'm Heather.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Hawa.
And this is our podcast, These Books Made Me. Today, we're going to be talking about Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor. Friendly warning as always, this podcast contains spoilers. If you don't yet know who else drives the Silver Packard, continue at your own risk.
So I know that this wasn't everyone's first time reading the book. So how did your reread compare to the first time you read it? And did you read it when you were younger, or were you kind of like an adult by the first time you read it?
Okay, so I read this when I was in 7th grade for the first time. And this was actually on the required reading list for my 7th grade class. And the way we did it that year, Miss Robert had a very different way of doing required reading. So we got a list of, I think, 10 titles, and then there were 10 different projects, but you could like mix and match which project went with which title and which book you read during which month. So my memory is that the month that I chose Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, my friend Marty chose a book called A Light in the Forest, which is sort of a reboot child version of Last of the Mohicans about a boy that is adopted by a tribe during U.S. settlement times. His choice of project was to do a song about the book, which he set to American Pie by Don McLean. And it went, "Bye, bye, Mr. White Guy. I shot you with an arrow. Now you're going to die." So that is so linked to this book for me. I did not do a song for Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I did a diary. So we had the option to like diary as the main character. So I was Diary of Cassie, and I made it look very old and like tea stained.
Of course.
The pages, because it was a found object apparently. But no, I loved the book the first time I read it. I've reread it since as an adult and then reread it again for the pod. And I have to say that this is a hard one for me because while I love it and I think the writing is absolutely sparkling and beautiful, it's so hard because you know how much hurt you're in for as you read the book. Like, it's a tough book. Like, there's a lot of just sadness in it. And so it's kind of that cringe of like, you know what's coming. So like every scene with TJ, it's just like, oh no, oh no. Yeah. But beautiful book. I love it.
Can I just say, like, did you even go to elementary school if you didn't tea stain a page at some point for a project? Like, I think that's required. No matter how old the document was, it definitely has to be tea stained. But yeah, I didn't read this book as a child, but I read it, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, just because I was like, this is like a very important text that I have somehow completely been able to skip over. And my experience of rereading it is that I was telling everyone earlier, I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads when I first read it. And I was kicking myself now because I'm like, this is definitely a 5-star book. And I don't know why I withheld that 5th star. So I've corrected the record now. I really enjoyed the reread. And I think part of it is like, kind of like what Heather was saying, going into it the second time when you know so much more, it's a richer experience. And I think every reread probably would add something to the experience of reading it.
I also read it as a child. I don't know exactly when. I feel like I kind of read it almost like a required read because although I was homeschooled and so grades had no meaning to me, my mother, who was my teacher at the time, had us read basically everything on the Newbery list that she could get her hands on. So I remember that was one of the books she handed to me. And I have a very poor memory. So I remembered very few details of the book until I reread it for this. But I do remember coming away with an impression that it was a very powerful story. As an adult, I mean, I've obviously have a different perspective and know more history. So I think it had a greater impact on me rereading it as an adult, but I do recall the impact as a child, even though I really didn't understand a lot of it.
I think it's so funny that you mentioned that you have a terrible memory because for me, I don't really remember a lot of books that I read as a kid. Even with Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, it's probably the only book I remember from my childhood. And I think for me, it stood out more so like I didn't remember the plot when I reread it. So the first time I reread it was about a year ago because the final book in the series was coming out. So for me, it felt like I was reading it for the first time, and it just felt so like, I was like, wow, this is a children's book, but it's really it's written where everyone can, really enjoy it and take something out of it. So it really stood out to me. So rereading it again for this, it was like you all said, like you knew what was coming. You were trying to prepare yourself. But yeah, my first reread, it felt like I was reading it for the first time. The only thing that I really remember from it as a child, I think, was the cover that stood out to me. And I don't want to get too much into that just yet, but it just stood out to me. And that was the one thing I remember as a child.
It is interesting that you bring up that it's a children's book, Hawa, because I think all of us had that perception of it. And certainly at the library, it's in the children's section. When I was doing research, though, on the author part of the pod, Mildred Taylor seemed downright offended that this is considered a children's book. Like she didn't intend it to be that way. And it really was just the publishers saying it will sell better if we frame it that way. She compared it to Kill a Mockingbird and said it was written for adults. It just happens to have a child protagonist. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it certainly is a valuable book for children to read. But then I think all of us reading it as adults, you can appreciate other things, other elements. You have more historical context to interpret it with.
Honestly, you saying that makes it some of the elements of it make a lot of sense, because I was reading this, I was like, yeah, I know that Cassie is the narrator, but it almost kind of feels like it's an older Cassie that's narrating it almost, or like it just felt like she had so much wisdom for the time. And I'm just like, I don't know, maybe because of the things that she seen and experienced, maybe it made her feel like she had to grow up earlier. But for her to say that it's not she didn't intend for it to be a children's book kind of makes it make a lot of sense.
And we spent so much time in the story. And yes, Cassie, we get Cassie's 9-year-old perspective, but she's also, we hear dialogue from the adults talking about, very adult things. I think throughout the book, I was very struck by how much that happens. Like she's overhearing lots of conversations. Well, I thought we could go on to a plot summary. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry takes place in 1930s rural Mississippi during the Great Depression. Written from the perspective of 9-year-old Cassie Logan, it tells the story of the Logan family as they strive to work their land and maintain their independence in the face of relentless racial and social injustices. Cassie, along with her brothers Stacy, Christopher John, and Clayton Chester, known as Little Man, struggle to cope with and understand these injustices that they encounter at school and in their larger community. The Logan children regularly endure being covered with dust or mud by a bus full of jeering white children as they walk to school. Cassie sees her parents encountering the same prejudices as adults. When the Logan family organizes a boycott of the Wallace's local store because the Wallaces are directly involved in recent horrific violence against African Americans in the community, Mr. Wallace and other powerful members of the community unite against the Logans. Mrs. Logan loses her teaching position, but she and Mr. Logan stand firm in continuing the boycott, despite Mr. Wallace and Harlan Granger, a local businessman, who wants the Logan's land for his own, intimidating the other families who are participating in the boycott of the Wallace's store. The Wallaces resort to outright violence and attack the Logan's wagon as they are driving to Vicksburg to purchase items from a distant store to supply the participants in the boycott with goods. Mr. Logan is badly injured. Next, Granger uses his influence to cause the bank to demand that the rest of the loan that the Logans have be paid in full immediately. Their Uncle Hammer is forced to sell his silver Packard to help them pay the balance. A former friend of the Logan children, TJ, is framed for robbery by 2 white teenagers and flees to the Logan farm in an attempt to find safety from the mob who is attempting to lynch him. Mr. Logan manages to prevent TJ from being killed by setting the cotton fields on fire, which forces all those nearby to work together to put out the fire.
Now for a little bit about Mildred Taylor. The dedication that prefaces the book reads, "To the memory of my beloved father, who lived many adventures of the boy Stacy, and who was in essence the man David. In 1943, Mildred Taylor was born to Wilbert and Delitha Taylor in Mississippi, a place that provides the setting for Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Though she left Mississippi as a young child when her family moved to Toledo, Ohio, the Mississippi of Taylor's book is vivid in a way that almost serves as a character as much as a setting. This fully realized sense of place stems from the rich oral history her family passed down to her through their stories and recollections and family trips back to Mississippi. Quote, I remember my grandparents' house, the house my great-grandfather had built at the turn of the century, and I remember the adults talking about the past. As they talked, I began to visualize all the family who had once known the land, and I felt as if I knew them too. Mildred honored these stories not only by creating the Logans and their story, but by also weaving the idea of familial memory and the importance of oral history into the events of the book, frequently showing the Logans passing down their own stories to the next generation. Mildred attended the University of Toledo for her undergraduate degree. She then spent multiple years with the Peace Corps in Ethiopia and continued her involvement as a recruiter and trainer. She returned to school and obtained her master's in journalism at the University of Colorado, a state that would become a permanent home for her. While she was at Colorado, Mildred successfully advocated for the creation of a Black Studies program. She was briefly married and had a daughter, Portia, ultimately divorcing prior to the publication of her first novel. Her first book, Song of the Trees, was published in 1975 and also takes place through the eyes of Cassie Logan. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry followed in 1976 and received critical praise and numerous awards, including the Newbery in 1977. She followed this with several other books, all but two of which centered on the lives and stories of the Logans, finally concluding their story with 2019's All the Days Past, All the Days to Come. Regarding the Logan saga, Mildred Taylor said in an interview with the American Library Association, quote, to me, that is so uplifting to find that there are still those who read my books and not only feel a greater understanding about our past, but feel the relevancy of that past to apply to the great turmoil of today's world.
And now let's hear from Ella. Each episode, our intrepid researcher will enchant us with scintillating factoids related to our book. It's time to dive in and explore Ella's ephemera.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Ella, and this is my ephemera, the part of the podcast where I tell you about some of the neat things I've learned while doing research. When I was growing up, my elementary school had what we called the textbook closet. On the second day of the school year, every grade would have an hour to go down and get their books from the closet. You'd get one textbook for every core subject. My favorite part was taking them home afterwards and wrapping them in paper grocery bags, which I then got to decorate. These sets may have felt ancient to me when I was a child, but they weren't nearly as old as the idea of the textbook itself. Textbooks date back to the ancient Greeks, who wrote their own educational texts following the invention of their alphabet in the late 9th or early 8th century BC. Although the famous Greek philosopher Socrates worried that no longer relying on memorization would, quote, weaken the Greeks' mental capacities, the text became very popular. But what we would think of as modern-day textbooks, those mass-produced for classroom sets, were made possible by the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. After compulsory universal public education laws were introduced in the 19th century, what we would think of as mandatory education laws, the textbook earned its permanent place in our K-12 classrooms. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I'm Ella, and this was my ephemera.
All right, so let's get into a little bit of discussion about this great book. First, let's start off. How do you all think that this book held up? I mean, it's historical fiction, so...
Yeah, I think it holds up great. And I think sort of couching it in it's historical fiction, yeah, that might make it seem like it would hold up better just because it's about the past. But I actually think a lot of historical fiction is incredibly problematic on reread in a way that this book is not.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree. I think it holds up extremely well. And I agree with you, Heather. I think as we've been going through this project, I kind of expect and anticipate that in every book there's going to be something that kind of makes me uncomfortable or that we just wouldn't say today, or even if the author had the best of intentions, it's just things have changed. And for me, this book felt current. It felt like something that someone would write today and would still have as a historical fiction work a lot of relevance, and it does have there's a lot of issues that come up that we're still grappling with today, that kids are still learning about, and I think there's a lot of educational value in the book still.
I agree too. I think there's a evergreen quality to this book. I mean, you and Heather have already said a lot of why that is, but I just think it really rings true and it's enduringly relevant.
So it's interesting because I see that we all agree that the book has held up pretty well, but despite that, it's still on the ALA's probably like top 100 list of books that have been banned throughout the country for various reasons. A lot of the original bans focused on being banned for the offensive language, which if anybody has read the book, that you know that they use the N-word in this book. And there also have been recent bans that have focused on the depiction of racism, which I think is interesting because the article that I read, it talks about how, there was a school that banned the book because there were 4 parents who wanted the book to be banned. This one amongst others, like To Kill a Mockingbird, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Of Mice of Men. And 3 of the parents are Black. And they said that the book challenged the book for potential harm to the district's 400 Black students. So in the article, it talks about how, one of the white students approached a Black student and was like taunting them using the N-word. And they said that the student learned that word from the book. So that was why they wanted to ban the book. And to me, I don't think that I definitely see how those children should be traumatized. I think, but can be traumatized by that. I think that it's more of you should teach your children better, not we should ban this book that has very real experiences in it, and most likely I think that was kind of like a cop out, because most likely if the kid felt comfortable saying that word to a child, that wasn't the first time they heard it.
Yeah, hot take. If that was the first time their child heard the N-word and they took from this book that was okay to taunt someone with, they've failed miserably as parents. But I agree.
Yeah,
I think that there's no way that's the first time
that's your
child.
Takeaway,
right?
Exactly.
That just if that's what you took away from that book, that it's okay to call someone that word, you really did not read the book.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and then the parenting is obviously, in play there as well.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead, Kelsey.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Hava.
I was going to say, obviously, the parents have genuine concerns. Like she said that her daughter was traumatized, but, I think that them saying that the book is problematic, specifically because this article is touching on other books as well, but I don't necessarily feel like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry was problematic in that sense. Whereas, Heather, you mentioned, yes, it's historical fiction and other books may not have held up as well. I think some of the other books that are mentioned in this article, like To Kill a Mockingbird, Huckleberry Finn, maybe may not have held up as well, but I don't necessarily think that's the case for Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about while I was reading this, I'm also doing a rewatch of the show Parenthood right now. And there's an episode where there's a mixed child on the show and he hears the N-word for the first time and his parents are struggling to talk to him about it or figuring out how to provide context about what is the history of this word. And while it was interesting to watch the show while reading this, because I was thinking they should obviously talk to him, but also give him this book, because I feel like that really would help me as a child understand that's why this word, that's how this word was used. That's why I shouldn't use it. That's the context. Obviously, there's all different ways to learn it, but I just was thinking this would be such a useful educational resource.
Yeah. And it's interesting that when you said this book had been challenged very frequently, I often feel that books that are banned, books that are challenged, they can kind of wear that as a badge of honor sometimes, because often it means you're making someone uncomfortable in a way that they need to be made uncomfortable. But I was also imagining that the challenges were whitewashing. It was saying no, we don't want this depiction of racism because, I don't see color, or whatever the buzzwords in that particular complaint would have been. So it's interesting to hear that it was coming from the parents of Black children objecting to how it was making their kids feel in the classroom. And I can imagine this would be a really hard book to teach. Obviously I came at this as required reading, but because of the way it worked, we were presenting something. It wasn't like we were reading as a class and having active discussions about the text. So I can see that it might be challenging to read this as a class. You know, how do you do that in a way that makes the classroom a safe space that doesn't make somebody traumatized by experiencing the book? And I do wonder how much of that had to do with how the book was being taught in that school versus the book itself.
That's a good point. I think how the book was being taught in that school definitely plays a role in that. And I mean, especially a lot of Black children who were surrounded by a lot of white children in school will definitely tell you that they remember the first time that they were called the N-word, or they remember the first time that, you know, maybe they were reading something in class, you know, like back in the day, you used to do like read alouds and stuff like that. And they would expect you to be the one to say the word. And it's just like, okay, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm comfortable saying it just because that I'm Black. So I definitely see where the parents were coming from with that, especially because they may have experienced something like that growing up too, and they didn't want their kids to feel that way. I just wish that the takeaway for the school system was in part, okay, so these kids are acting like this about this. How are we going to move forward, and how are we going to make sure that these kids are not traumatized by it? But also, how are we going to make sure that these kids who are going around taunting other kids know that this is not right? And the article doesn't address any of that at all. So
yeah, that seems like a behavioral issue and not a text issue.
Oh, for sure. Exactly. Yeah. And I think another thing, like you kind of mentioned, a lot of books that are banned, typically the books that need to be quote unquote banned, not to say that I believe in censorship, but you know, it's never really the ones that actually are banned. The ones that are banned are usually the ones that are, you know, out here. They have something to say about what's going on, or people don't like what's being reflected, possibly they feel like about themselves. Because I think that in this book, it shows that there are definitely different levels to racism. And I think that people feel like, you know, that could be a commentary of themselves, or even just, you know, yeah.
I wanted to talk about thinking about this book as a historical fiction and something that still holds up. And I think also speaking to like why I think it has so much value is like, I think it's it provides such nuance, and as you were saying, how well, like so many different levels of talking about this issue. And a scene that really stood out for me is when Stacy is talking to his father about Jeremy Sims wanting to be his friend and trying so hard to be his friend, and his father saying, you know, it's probably for the best that you stay away from him. And I think a lesser book, or a book that was trying, maybe not written by a person of color, would say, you know, oh, he's being nice. Like, that's a good, like, you should be friends with him. And I think it's much more interesting and much more complicated for the message to be, you need to protect yourself first. And like, it's great that he's being nice to you, but like, you need to create some distance and like, look out for your safety. And I feel like there's so many lessons for like, now if a child or an adult is trying to understand, like, why is it okay that there are Black only spaces? Or like, why are there like tensions? Like, I think that's a really interesting message too, that I was kind of reflecting on a lot while I was reading that. It's a very short scene, but it really stood out to me.
No, it's so funny that you brought that up, because that's actually what I was about to say before I hesitated. I think the whole scene with Jeremy Sims, like, you know, in the beginning, the very first chapter, the book starts off very serious, to be honest. In the very first chapter, they talk about how, you know, Jeremy Sims, he's this white child. They go to different schools. He meets up with them to walk halfway to school just to kind of go separate ways. And, you know, his sister basically says that, you know, like, they make fun of him because he's hanging out with these Black Logan children. Sometimes he'll come up the next day and he'll have like red welts on his arm. And his sister was like, yeah, you know, he got that from hanging out with you all. And he still insists on hanging out with them, even though they aren't super receptive to him. And I think that maybe some parents may see that scene as, well, why are you saying that he can't be friends with me just because he's white and you're Black and he hasn't even done anything wrong? Are you just putting all white people in the same box? And I think that they don't realize that it was what they had to kind of do to like almost protect themselves, especially back then. You never know what the intentions could be, or something could happen to him, and then all of a sudden it could get blamed on them. And I think even now, people think, as a Black woman, I think even still that we are still very mindful of like the kind of spaces that we, you know, take part in, and you don't want something that you do to kind of reflect or fall back on someone. So I think I could see why parents would would have a problem with it. Not necessarily like I believe that, but yeah.
I feel like there is nuance there in the book though, as well, because you don't just have that in isolation. You also have the character of Mr. Jameson, where I felt that the book was trying to point us towards like, hey, best case scenario, Jeremy grows up and he can do better than this even, but this is kind of the best we have right now is Mr. Jameson saying, yes, I'll take a bit of a risk. Yes, I'll back the debt. Yes, I will intervene and try to keep them from, lynching TJ when they go to the Avery's house. So I think there was something there that was, trying to point to, yes, this is sort of the end outcome. There can be some sort of relationship there. But again, yes, there's got to be some element of protection built in, especially because we're told, the Jamesons had been a good family. They were always, better citizens of the community, whereas the Sims, Jeremy's the outcast because of how he relates to the Logans, and probably other reasons too. I mean, he sleeps in a tree. He clearly doesn't fit in his family very well. So I don't know. I feel like, yeah, that's people kind of being obtuse about things on, if they're not seeing that there was meant to be a spectrum here, like this isn't meant to be shutting things down completely. It's showing that there's very few ways for this relationship to exist. And even best case scenario, it's going to be unbalanced in the end, right? Like one person has the power and you hope that they use it in a positive way rather than a negative way. But the system itself is broken.
I think people are used to these kinds of stories having more white saviors, and that this story didn't do that. And that's the problem with it for them.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it genuine.
Well, like you were saying, how you see the risks for Jeremy and Mr. Jameson are so much less than they are for the Logan children or the Logan adults.
Right. Because it's like for Jeremy and Mr. Jameson, like, they're acting and they're acting and doing what they're doing, and the consequences are possibly there. But for the Logan children, they're just like, I'm scared to even get to that point because I don't even want to see what those consequences could look like. Meanwhile, Jeremy's kind of seeing them and he's just like, well, I'm still going to keep on at it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, we all know Cassie's like a main character in this book, and I guess that plays a major role as to why she's on the cover of all these. Do you all think that she's a good role model? And like, what do you think that we could learn from her?
I think she's a very relatable role model. I mean, she certainly has her flaws. Her temper is quick, and that's mentioned several times in the book. And of course, she gets herself into a real pickle when they go into town with their grandmother. But she's strong and she doesn't back down. And, she's very smart. She cares deeply about her family. I think she seems pretty open-minded. She seems to be very curious about other people. Mr. Morrison, she kind of takes to him immediately. She's not, put off by him being there. She wants to learn more about him. So she seems to be willing to meet people where they're at. So I think there's a lot there. I was really seizing on her dad saying, Cassie, you're a lot like me, but you have Uncle Hammer's bad temper. Mm-hmm. And her dad in the book, his name is David. And this is really a David and Goliath story, isn't it? Right? Like it's the people that are trying to take down this giant thing that's so much bigger than them, mm-hmm. by organizing the boycott, by, trying to use their cleverness to get around systems that are just, so awful. Setting the fire is just brilliant because it's probably the only way that things could have worked out as they did.
Yeah, and you think about what Cassie did with Lillian Sims, and that was kind of like her being her dad, right? Because if she was being like her Uncle Hammer, she would have just like screamed at her and got herself in trouble and probably caused really big drama between the families. But she played this long game with the, acting like her like personal assistant for a while. And then finally, when it was the right time, making sure that everything was in place so that she could kind of get her revenge and teach this girl a lesson, but not have any like consequences.
Both.
She's like, I have all your secrets.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like she got to be Uncle Hammer and her dad in that moment. She had the long game with the like blackmail, but she also, you know, she beat her up pretty good.
Yeah. 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 I really admire Cassie has a very, very clear sense of right and wrong. She has a very clear sense of herself. And she's like, Heather said, very open-minded. And I really appreciated that. And I could see myself really aspiring to that as a young reader.
I mean, I think she's brave. I think she's relatable, like you said. I mean, I also see her, I see her dad and her uncle. For me, the establishing character moment for Cassie was near the beginning when they got the books in school and they're old and they're falling apart and they're dirty, and little man who likes things to be, neat and clean and fresh comes up and says, ask for another book. And, she like observes him observing the book, and she's like feeling bad for him because she knows he'll be upset. And then she, sort of like bravely like makes a fuss to try to take some of the attention off him, even though she knows there'll be consequences for that. I think that is like a very, she's maybe a little bit impetuous, but, she has heart and perception and compassion at the same time.
I think I definitely found Cassie to be relatable. She kind of reminded me of herself. She definitely kind of had like a mouth on her. I'm glad that you brought up the thing with the textbooks, because that's something that I kind of want to go back to. I thought that whole scene was really interesting because it was kind of the first time in the book that you see some kind of variation of the N-word. And, it's interesting to see how the teacher reacted, because she was basically like, he can't read. What is he upset about? And then even when Cassie's like, no, he can read. And she's just like, still, well, these books are, whatever. It was really interesting to see how the mom reacted. Versus how their teacher reacted. Were you guys surprised that she acted like that? The teacher acted like that anyway.
No, because I think that, and one of the things we've sort of talked about with feminism on this podcast, like how much things get internalized. Mm-hmm. So when a system is wrong or it's flawed or it's stacked against you, that's built into everything, right? Like it's built into the language, it's built into things like the books. Like there's no way that doesn't get internalized in some way. And so for her teacher, Daisy Crocker, I think was her name, to sort of be like, well, no, we should just be glad that we have the books. Yeah. And like, this is just the way things are. I'm sure from her perspective, she felt like she was doing the best thing. She's making sure that the kids get educated, and that's better than them being not educated.
Yeah.
And, I thought it was a really interesting dichotomy between the person that kind of is okay and accepting of the status quo without making that be a bad person, right? Like, she's doing what she thinks she needs to do to get along and do the best for the kids, whereas Mary takes a stand on it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure she was scared, honestly. Like, I think what was interesting for me was that even when she had the conversation with, their mother was just like, well, are you going to punish them? And she's just like, yeah, I got this. Like, really, she was just like, I'm going to go back and cover all my 7th graders' books too. So they're going to know exactly who did it. So you don't have to worry about getting in trouble. I think that, of course, as a teacher, I don't think that she would have stood for the destroying of the books in front of her students, but it would have been interesting to see if she kind of had a slightly different approach when talking to Mama. But then again, I think they always saw Mama as being kind of like disruptive.
Well, and it's cool to me because it shows like to a reader all the different ways you can protest, right? It's not just marching, which has a lot of value, but it's also boycotting. It's also putting a piece of paper over a page in your book. Like, it's a very small act, but it has sends a really big message to all the students in her class. It sends a big message to the school when they find out. And there's all these different levels of kind of pushing back in all different ways. And I think if you're a child who's reading this and really conscious of all the issues that exist in the world, seeing all these different ways you can kind of push back against these issues and not just have to accept the status quo is really powerful.
I think it's interesting because it also shows the different ways, like, yeah, just because they were both Black women, they didn't both feel the same way about this one topic. So that was also kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice bit of writing too. I mean, again, I think this book is it's pretty sophisticated for a children's book, whether she meant it to be a children's book or not, it's still good writing. And just sort of the Chekhov's school book there, right? It was, you see the books and maybe you're not thinking that that's going to come back in any real sense. And then it comes back later with the school board coming in and firing her. But then it comes back later again at the end of the day. I mean, with TJ, I think probably losing his life at the end of the book. I think certainly things point that direction. To some degree, started back with that simple act of defiance on their mom's part.
Did this is a bit of a tangent, but did she have to do any rewrites to make it, like, once they decided that it was going to be a children's book, did she have to rewrite anything, or did they just kind of she had already written it and they just categorized it that way?
They just categorized it that way. And she's an interesting person. So I think Cassie must be a lot like she was as a child. She seems very unbending on certain things. So her very first novel didn't end up getting published because she objected to the rewrites that the editors wanted to make to publish it. So she just never published it. And then later she was talking about how at various times when they were going to republish the books, there were asks for certain pieces to be omitted, particularly around the language or to tone down certain scenes, and she refused to budge on any of it. So no, it seemed like it was just a publisher's choice. Like, okay, it's got a child as a protagonist. I think the words that she used was that the publisher said it would get lost in adult fiction.
Because I'm like thinking back over it and thinking, would I have read it as a children's book if it hadn't been categorized to me as a children's book before I read it? And like, there are definitely some scenes where I feel like she kind of over explains, like in a way that you do in a children's book and you maybe wouldn't in an adult book. Like when her dad sets the field on fire, like you probably didn't need the extra sentence that said like, I figured it out. He set the field on fire. So like, I think it does kind of read like a children's book, but I'm curious if anyone felt differently. And sorry, this is like a bit of a tangent, but I'm very interested in.
No, it's not. So from my most recent reread, it's weird because I was kind of like going back and forth on whether or not it felt like it was written for a child or written for an adult. Like certain things like they make references to the KKK, and I don't remember if they actually ever said KKK or Klan, but they'll say stuff like, oh, they're rioting tonight or they're burning. And it's just like, depending on the age that a child reads this, I don't know if they would understand that those are references to the KKK, but an adult definitely would.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the first chapter of this book does a really great job at introducing us to the personalities of the Logan children. I think that all the children, or just this family in general, they all really have like really distinct personalities. And they're also just a really close-knit family. I feel like you can tell, like when Cassie sees Papa in that second chapter, when he's coming with, Mr. Morrison, they all just get so excited and they just jump all over him. So how did their family dynamic make you feel, I guess? Like, or any thoughts that you have about just like their family dynamic in general? I can reword that question.
It felt very realistic to me. Yeah, it felt very realistic to me. It seemed like a living, breathing family. Those are the kinds of dynamics you have in a family. All of the characters did seem fully realized and like individuals and not just plot points or set dressing.
Yeah. I like that they were all kind of seemingly like on one accord. Like when when TJ gets their mom fired, that was Stacy's best friend, but and I'm sure it was hard for him to kind of like distance himself, but he was like, no, this is my mom. Like, I can't believe y'all did that, And of course, TJ goes through his like struggles to, like towards the end of the story. But before that, they're like, no, we're not talking to him. Like, you got my mom fired.
Yeah, I think Stacy is a really interesting character because he's got such a challenging time where he's, his dad's away. He's trying to figure out like how to be the man of the house or whatever, trying to negotiate the dynamics where he feels a lot of pressure that he's kind of putting on himself in a lot of ways to, take care of his family, to be responsible for those things. And his dad's trying to figure out how to slowly bring him into that without overburdening him because he is 12. And I think that was really interesting to see as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Logan family feels very warm. I mean, they don't feel like a family that, they don't feel like a unrealistically perfect family. They're clearly human, and they argue and they have struggles, but there's just this like warmth that you kind of feel, from every member of the family that is very appealing.
She just does a really good job with families in general in this book, I think, because even the other more peripheral families feel very well developed. The Averys, you get a real sense of what life in that home would be like. The dad is not in the greatest of health. TJ has sort of run wild. Claude is embarrassed by his brother's behavior. The mom feels like the whole situation has gotten away from her. The Sims, similarly, you get a really good sense from both Lillian's behavior and then Jeremy's words about his family of what life in that home looks like. I think she has a really good sense of observation and sense of people, and being able to convey that in the book. All of the characters in this book feel very, very rich to me, and they feel like human beings and not just, an archetype. I guess.
All the characters definitely really have their own. It doesn't feel like they're just copy paste with a couple things changed about the characters. Like, no, they're all like super like defined. I think she does a really great job of like making Jeremy out to be like the black sheep of his family. She does a really good job with that also.
I have questions about his treehouse that he sleeps in. But that's a tangent. I'm sorry.
How do you all feel about, the ending of the book?
The last lines, man, they hit. I cried for TJ and I cried for the land. Is that right?
Yes. I cried for TJ, for TJ and the land.
It's just, I mean, you can't help but, wonder what's going to happen to TJ, and you can't feel that it's going to be good. And then I'm worrying about the family being able to pay their bills down the road with, having lost some of their crop, and, their father not being able to work on the railroad. I know they got the mortgage or the loan paid off, but I mean, that's, maybe a smaller thing, but like, it's going to have an effect on them. And it's just a very bleak outlook.
Yeah, there's no neat happy ending, but in some sense, it was the least bad ending possible, given how off the rails things had gone by the end, all set in motion by TJ and his bad choices. The dad doesn't sugarcoat that, yeah, TJ's probably going to hang for this. It'll be a judicial hanging, but you've got a dead shop owner and two white boys saying TJ did it. So the ending is not like a children's book.
Is it okay if I read some of the ending? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is going to be a little bit before the last paragraph and just the last paragraph. Come October, we would trudge to school as always, barefooted and grumbling, fighting the dust and the mud in the Jefferson Davis school bus, but TJ never would again. I had never liked TJ, but he had always been there, a part of me, a part of my life, just like the mud and the rain, and I had thought that he would always be, yet the mud and the rain and the dust would all pass. I knew and understood that. What had happened to TJ in the night I did not understand, but I knew that it would not pass. And I cried for those things which had happened in the night and would not pass. I cried for TJ and the land. And I think that it ending that way, we all knew that Cassie didn't really like TJ, but I think that, at the end of the day, it still kind of felt like, he was one of our own. So she was really, hurt to see that happen.
Well, and it's an injustice. And we've seen throughout, Cassie can't deal with injustice. Like, that is her thing. It sets her off. So, she's like her mom in a lot of ways, right? Her mom's organizing the boycott. Cassie is, organizing her campaign against Lillian. That all stems back from the injustice done to her in that shop and on the street. For all of TJ's failings, he didn't murder that man. And there's no consequences for the actual perpetrators of that. He just made bad choices in Friends and was along for the ride. But he's going to be the one that does the time for it or probably loses his life over it. And again, just such good writing because that's what he did to Stacy with the cheating, right?
Yeah.
He threw Stacy under the bus and he, earlier threw Claude under the bus for things. Claude got whipped for something that TJ did. Stacy got whipped for something that TJ did, to then close it with the same thing happening on a much more horrific scale to TJ. That's tough. And I think that produces the sort of like conflicted feelings that someone does feel when someone that's part of your life, but not a person that you love particularly, but is there, even if they're maybe not a person you even like, when they pass. You do have these conflicted feelings like Cassie does at the end of the book, where it's like, well, he was always there. And so there is a sense of loss, even if she didn't like him. I think it's beautiful writing. Well,
and it ties back to this idea about, can they really trust Jeremy? He's being nice, but we don't know how honest that is or when it's going to turn. And obviously for TJ, he trusted RW and Melvin, even though he kind of probably knew deep down, they were not great, but he kind of felt like he could hang with them or was exceptional in some way, or things would be different for him. And they weren't. And I think that ties back to that piece as well. Of like, you don't really know who you can trust or what's going to happen if you let your guard down.
Yeah, I like that you touched on that because I was literally just about to say that. Like, he got caught up with them thinking he was just having a good old time and he didn't necessarily think, and, granted, you as a reader, you may have hoped that he would think, okay, well, I'm actually I'm not just hanging with these guys just to have fun. I'm doing all these things that I'm not supposed to be doing. I should be a bit more careful. You almost kind of want to warn him, no, stop, don't do this because, if something happens, you're the one that's going to take the fall for it. Look at you and look at these two and see the difference. But, it doesn't really necessarily happen that way. And I think that, the book ending on that kind of, you don't really know what the consequence that happens to him, I think is very intentional. And I think it also does a great job of setting you up to kind of want to read the next one to kind of find out what happens if they touch on that. But yeah, I think it's very powerful.
I have a question for you guys about TJ. So before the robbery that goes horribly wrong happens, TJ brings Melvin and RW around to say these are my buddies and they get me anything I want. And they're there to sort of back that up and be like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. And then TJ says, even that pistol that I wanted at the Barrett's store. And no one really cares. At that point, TJ has been cut off. He has been excommunicated from their circle. So they don't really react. TJ's reaction to that perplexed me somewhat because I don't know that I quite understood what he was hoping that would accomplish, because she then says that TJ was dejected and he says something it didn't even matter to them. What was he hoping for in that moment? Was he thinking that if he said, hey, these guys will even get me that gun, that then he'd be somehow accepted back into the fold because he was so cool? Or I don't know. I couldn't really understand what was going through TJ's head in that moment and what he was trying to accomplish.
I mean, I feel like TJ was definitely trying to fill a void with hanging out with those guys. And maybe almost in a way, maybe he subconsciously knew that he shouldn't have been hanging out with them and was hoping that maybe if he goes back to his old friends and is like, hey, look at these new friends that I've got. They can even do all this for me, that maybe they'll kind of take him back in, maybe they'll be like, oh my God, you're so cool. And we're really missing out on you. And, in his mind, that could have possibly been what he was thinking. It might have been a reach, but I think that he was really trying to fill a void with hanging out with those two instead. And I think that had they not been cut off from each other, I don't necessarily think that he would have gone down that road of hanging out with them. And I also would hope that even if he had then gone down that road, then him and Stacy might have been cooler, and maybe Stacy would have been like, no, like this is not something she should be doing, as opposed to I don't think Stacy definitely would have gone down that road as well with him.
I think he wanted them to be impressed, maybe welcomed back. As frustrating as TJ's behavior was, that you kind of see like a kid who just wants to belong. He wants people to think he's cool, to be respected. I think he maybe thought that if he showed up with his friends, whether or not he wanted them to take them back, and if they would, he wanted them to be impressed by him.
Yeah, and I think they all kind of like, I don't remember if they explicitly say it, but implicitly, like, you shouldn't be hanging out with those Wallace boys. Well, they say, like, don't go down to the store, but that's like the fact that it's forbidden kind of makes it cool in a way.
Yeah.
And then also this idea that like, oh, like I got these cooler friends who have money and access to resources and power, and they let me hang around with them. And now I'm going to get access to this like privilege and power too by the gun. Like, isn't that cool? Wasn't it worth it that I kind of sold you out and ditched you for these guys? Because look what I get back. Like, I really think that like he felt like they would be impressed by him, like, quote unquote, leveling himself up in this way, or like getting this like higher status by being regarded by the Wallace boys.
So anybody have any final thoughts on this book? I can go first if that helps. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of rereading books, to be honest, but this book is one that I will go back to time and time again. This is probably my third read of the book. I read it about a year ago when the final version, or the final of the series was coming out. And I think if you give yourself time in between, it definitely like hits different each and every time. There are things that I picked up on this last reread that I didn't pick up on before. And I hope that everybody gets a chance to read this book if you haven't already.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I'm glad I reread it for this. It was hard at times again because it's very bleak, and what's coming. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn has a lot of sadness in it too, but ultimately the end, people land on their feet. So you have that. So it's a good like, oh, I just want to cry, and then I move on because things work out for Francie in the end. This one, it's just, it ends so bleak that I think it's a hard one to revisit, but I think it's very worthwhile because it's really, really well written.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we reread this. I mean, I remember liking it, but it was so long ago, and my memory, as I mentioned, is so bad that it was really good to delve into it again, especially with adult eyes. I think there are a lot of things I just, wasn't mature enough to really reflect on and understand when I read it before.
Agree. I don't have anything insightful that everyone else hasn't already said.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that we all enjoyed it. This isn't a first though, because did you all enjoy the last book?
I think so. I think everybody more or less enjoyed it. This one, though, Kelsey's bumping her rating up to 5 stars now on Goodreads. So.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this one the most so far, I think.
It's so funny because right before I came in, I was looking at Goodreads reviews of people that I'm friends with on Goodreads just to see what they had to say about this book. And everybody's thoughts pretty much were along the lines of yours, Kelsey, whereas like, I read it as a kid and I enjoyed it or I read it before and I enjoyed it for my first read. It had an impact, but rereading it makes me realize how well it's done.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read it, check it out.
Then read it again. All right. Coming up, we'll get an expert's take on an important aspect of this novel that is not often discussed. But first, we'll pay some bills.
Learn a new language from home or on the go with Mango. Mango's award-winning courses bring you practical phrases from real-life situations in a way that makes you want to start the conversation. Every learner's experience is unique. Mango adjusts to your learning pace, teaching you until you feel confident with new words and phrases, creating a learning solution centered around you. Visit PGCMLS.info and click on the Online Library tab to learn more. Would you like to learn something new while at home? Develop and expand your creativity by learning how to sketch, sew, knit, cook, and more with Creative Bug. All you need is your library card.
Thank you so much for joining me today for our Community Corner. If you could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Marsha Quarles, and I work at the South Bowie Branch. I've been working in the Prince George's County Memorial Library System now for going on, I guess, about 36 years. So I've worked at about 7 to 8 branches in the system.
Wow, that's a long time. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience with and your memories of the book Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry?
So I first read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry back in the late 90s. And I remember reading the book, and I couldn't put it down. And then at the very end, when it was over, I was just left kind of numb because there were so many themes and so much going on in the story. But it had an impact on me.
I know that you shared that you've been reflecting on some of the experiences that Cassie and the other characters in the book experience, and how there's a lot of comparisons you can draw to today. Can you talk a little bit about what you notice and some of the longevity of some of the plot points in the book?
Sure. So Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, if I'm remembering correctly, is from an old Negro spiritual. And the spiritual pretty much goes like this: roll of thunder, hear my cry, one man coming down the line, whip in hand to meet me down. And, I was thinking about how the Logan family and Mr. Morrison, are trying to take a stand against the injustice against blacks and whites by the whites during Jim Crow era in Mississippi. And I was also thinking that a lot of these injustices are just the same as they are today. There's still violence, there's still lynchings, there's still killings, and they come in different forms now. They're not, by hidden by the Ku Klux Klan wearing masks. They're actually occurring by police and in the form of police brutality. And, it's still happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you shared that you've also had some personal experiences that you, while reading about Cassie, drew some connections to as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about when Cassie was at the market and she had to stand and she had to wait for an hour to be served. And Black people experience that kind of shopping while Black, as we call it, experiences quite a bit, where we're denied entrance to stores, we refuse service, we get have ethnic slurs thrown at us. I remember going into I won't say the name of the store, but the store was a big name store when it first came to the county. And I was so excited to go there. So we walked in the store, and the minute I walked in the store, I started being followed. And I don't usually, have outbursts in stores, but I do remember turning to this person and just saying, I'm not going to steal anything. And I walked out. And so I just kind of, that resonated with me again when I thought about, Cassie having to speak up for herself just to get service, and then what happened to her when she did get service. And so we're taught to restrain ourselves, but sometimes it's hard to do so.
So do you feel like the book still has some relevance for children these days, or they might draw similar comparisons, especially, children of color who might be reading this book?
I think so, because as a historical fiction, it does talk about the South. It talks about how Blacks were treated during the Jim Crow era. And I think children need to know this. I do like that it is told from the perspective of Cassie, I believe she's 9 years old in the story. And so you hear it from a child's perspective. And I also like the way the author continued the stories in several smaller books that they're written, in a way that children can really understand them. And they're very short stories, but they're very powerful and strong short stories. So, yes, I think they're definitely relevant for kids today. They're often on a lot of reading lists, and I often give out this story to parents who want their children to learn more about African American history. This is one of my go-to books to give them.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share?
Just that this book will resonate with you if you read it. It's a very difficult read. It is not an easy story to read. You will feel what Cassie and her brothers and her father and Mr. Morris and her mom are feeling But it's okay to feel that way, because I think we need, especially our children, they need to know, and they need to know that it's not a good feeling. It wasn't fair. It wasn't nice. And you can process the story with them and talk to them about it, after you read it. And I also suggest if parents can read alongside with their children as they're reading the book, and you can talk about some of the things that are happening together. So I definitely recommend this book as a good read.
Spoken like a true librarian. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Marsha, for joining me today and for your excellent insights.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And now it's time for everyone's favorite segment, in which I practice for my future career as a time travel agent, helping prepare travelers for life in different eras. It's time for the 1930s Price is Right. All right, so all of you are playing this game. I'm going to start out by giving you some, to sort of place you in time a little bit in terms of like how much buying power a dollar had in, 1930s. So I went and looked up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had a calculator where you could put in like an amount and then years and, get equivalents. So in 1934, in which our book is set, a dollar had about the same buying power as approximately $20 in 2021 money. And in July 1930, I couldn't get an exact year, but I figure it's, better than nothing. The average starting wage for common labor was 43 cents per hour. I'm telling you this to give you a fighting chance, because if you'd asked me to guess the costs of these items, I would have no idea how to.
Doesn't Uncle Hammer say that they make like a quarter a day on the farm when they're sharecropping?
That's right. They does.
So they make less than 1 hour of I'm assuming white laborer's wage.
Yeah, this didn't didn't specify. I think this is like an average, so obviously it's,
the 43 cents would be relatively in keeping with minimum wage now, but yes, that would be extraordinarily low for 25 cents a day.
It is.
It'd be awful.
So I do not think that the characters in our book were making 43 cents per hour as their starting wage. Okay, so we're going to start with something common that we all either use regularly or know about, with milk. So I'm going to ask all of you to give me your best guess as to what a gallon of milk in 1930s the United States would have cost, and if we're going by Price is Right rules, you have to get as close as possible without going over in order to win.
Okay.
So, all right, Hawa, let's start with you. What is your best guess for what a gallon of milk would have cost?
34 cents.
That's expensive milk. Okay.
You have a good point. Dang. I'll keep that in mind for the next question.
But maybe milk was more expensive.
It may have been because so many people were producing their own milk then still. Yeah. Okay. But the milkman came around, right? I feel like it was like something like 5 cents or 10 cents.
Is that your final answer?
Yes, 5 or 10 cents is my final answer.
Your final answers. Which one do you want to?
That was very how much could a banana cost?
That's literally That's literally what I was thinking about.
I'll go with a nickel, I guess.
All right. Kelsey.
I think it cost 22 cents.
Okay, so it would have cost an average of 56 cents per gallon.
Holy cow, milk was expensive.
Yeah, I wonder if that's because...
That's like more than $10 a gallon.
But also a gallon is a lot of milk. But even still, thinking about how it translates to now, that's definitely a lot.
Yeah, I wonder if that's because it was harder to...
refrigerate and transport.
And opposed to having it delivered fresh by the milkman. I don't know. It bears more research.
I was thinking like, 5 and dime stores were a thing. So everything back then cost 5 cents or 10 cents, including milk. I was incorrect.
Well, I don't know. Just keep trying that strategy. It might work out for you.
Yeah.
All right. So that first round
Hawa wins.
The first one goes to Hawa because she chose 34 cents, which is the closest to 56 cents per gallon.
I was still pretty off though.
But you were, I mean, I feel like the clues I gave you about the buying power of $1 and the average wage really like does not account for all of these other factors like refrigeration and production. So maybe that was a little unfair of me to choose that. But I was like, milk, we have to talk about milk. All right, moving on to Kellogg's Corn Flakes. In 1934, I was able to find an exact price listed for 1934. How much would you pay for a box of Kellogg's?
Did it come in like a box like a box today? What did a box of cornflakes look like? I'm so curious.
I did not find that in my research. It said that it was eight ounces only, if that helps to give you like
that's a small box.
That's
a small much
box.
Smaller than that's like a grape nut size box of cornflakes.
Bigger than those like personal size.
What could it
boxes.
cost? 10 cents?
Is that your guess?
That's my final answer. 10 cents.
All right, 10 cents for Heather. Kelsey or Howie, you want to make a guess?
I went first last time.
I think
Kelsey.
I think if it's only 8 ounces, that's like 1 serving or 2 servings of cereal.
This is like 2 bowls.
I'm not going to spend more than like 7 cents on that.
That's what I was going to say.
6 cents.
Wow, you're just going to pigeonhole me right in there, huh?
I was going to say 7 and I can't go over, so I won't say 8.
I'm waiting for somebody to get the like prices right. $1, Bob, $1. But that would be a lot of money, so we're gonna have to wait for not
That's
a food
like a
product.
horse or something.
So 8 ounces in 1934, according to the price listing, that would have cost 8 cents. So that round goes to Kelsey.
You almost said 8 cents.
I should have said 8 cents. It's okay.
1 cent per ounce.
Oh, that's a good way of thinking of it for the next question. I don't know what it is, but...
So, I guess if you poured your expensive milk on your small box of cornflakes, that would be a very expensive breakfast, potentially.
Yeah.
All right. So our fourth, this is another food item. I got sort of bogged down in researching food prices. There is one non-food item that we're going to get to, but before we get there, we have to talk about Campbell's tomato soup. Now, I should say that this price that I found for 1934 is for 3 cans. So it's, not just 1 can, but 3 cans of Campbell's tomato soup. So I feel like I went first and then Kelsey went first. So Heather, you're it.
Man, I'm going to just stick with 10 cents.
If it ain't broke,
gotta
don't
work
fix
one
it.
time.
I'm the person bidding $1 every time on Contestants Row. 10 cents.
All right, 10 cents for Heather. Who wants to guess next?
I'll say 14 cents.
14 cents.
This is the price for 3 cans.
Yes.
Okay.
Three cans.
I'm going to say 20 cents.
That's a good one, too.
Mm-hmm. 20 cents. Okay, so the answer is exactly 20 cents.
Wow, nailed it. You win both showcases now.
Wow. Do I get a boat yet?
Oh, I should have priced boats. What could they cost? $10? How many times can we quote the same Lucille Bluth quote in the same episode?
I'm feeling very much like when my friend Marshall was on Price is Right and I made everyone get out of the dorm common room so I could watch him on Price is Right, and then he never got off of Contestant Row.
Oh.
And I mercilessly teased him, and now karma has returned and it's me.
Okay, so our last question is, so apparently in 1930, a very popular model of car was Ford Model A. And I will say that based on the different car prices that I looked at, this looks like it was a cheaper model. Like, there's a range of prices for cars than like there is now. And this wasn't the most expensive car, or maybe even the middle of the road pricing car. So what would you guess that one would pay for a 1930 Ford Model A?
So you're saying this is not the like middle of the road car. This is like the economy car. This is like the Corolla of the 30s.
Yeah, I think so. Like it was popular, but it seemed to be far more affordable than a lot of the other cars I looked at. I think I saw a couple average prices that were higher than what this was priced as.
It's today's Ford Focus.
Yeah, I think a Ford Focus or a Corolla is a good analogy.
Just wanted to keep it in the Ford family.
I'm going to say $304.
$304.
It always feels better when you make it like not a rounded 5 or 0.
Oh, for sure.
I think that's a strategy in the game, right? I've never really watched it that much, but
yeah, I think it is. I have no bidding strategy on this. How about
5 or 10 cents?
I was about to say,
that's your strategy.
Yes. So, all right, I will go with $500 and 10 cents.
Wow.
All right. $500 in.
Howell, what did you say?
Cents.
$304.
Okay, I'm going to say $375.
I feel like I might have lowballed this even still because $1 was like $20 for us. Were cars this cheap back then? I don't know.
Can't imagine someone having like $1,000.
You can't do that on the actual show.
I'm going to stick with $500.10 because that was the highest bid. So even if it turns out to be $1 million, I would win this one.
It's the 10 cents for me.
10 cents put it over the edge.
It's very consistent.
Okay, so it would have cost a 1930 Ford Model A $435.
No, I went over.
So that one goes to Kelsey.
Wow, I should audition for the real thing.
What was your guess? 375?
375.
You only guessed 375 because I said 304.
I know, I was going to go lower.
I
almost said 500 something too, though. So yeah,
it's so hard. Like, how do you guess that? Like, and car culture was relatively new then, so there's just very little.
Well, I guess there was less going on with cars back then too. Like, maybe cars cost so much now because there's safety features,
right?
And like computers built in, and
yeah, and I feel like the cost has to be like somewhere close to the cost of a horse and buggy, right? It can't be like wildly more expensive, otherwise who would buy it?
Right?
Is that crazy?
To make them more affordable to convince them to buy it, and now that we all need them, we pay whatever we have to.
That's literally what I was thinking. Like, they know that you're like, well, yeah, I'm gonna tell you this car is $20,000, but if you need it, you won't get it. So
I wish I could have a horse and buggy instead of a car. Now that you bring that up,
oh my God, all the poop you'd have to deal with, though.
It's fine.
Used to it.
All right. So that was fun. Thank you for that game. All right. So each episode, we ask whether our book passes the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test asks whether a work features two female characters who talk to each other about something that doesn't involve men or boys. So, does Roll of Thunder Hear My Cry pass the Bechdel test?
I think it does, but barely.
This is definitely the closest one to date, I think.
There are a couple of conversations, Mama and Miss Crocker, about the books, which I don't technically think has anything to do with men. I mean, in passing, Little Man is brought up because he stomped on the book. But when they're talking about the bigger issue of defacing the books, I don't think they're talking about guys. And then there's a couple of like maybe some kitchen conversations that happened that there's at least 2 lines of dialogue where a man doesn't come up.
It's hard because Cassie spends so much time with her brothers, and she's the only girl, so she's mostly talking to them, so she can't pass in those situations.
I think another thing that makes it so hard is that a lot of what goes on in the book, like a lot of the major events, like the violence that takes place happens to or about the men. So even when the women are talking, they're talking about, you know, what's going on to these men. So in that sense, it is kind of hard, especially because so many of the characters in the book, even if they're not necessarily main characters, are male.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think it does pass, though. It's just lucky that this test is a very low bar. It just barely glides over.
Yeah, as I was thinking maybe her conversations with Lillian, but Lillian's talking about her crush. So I'm not even sure. And that's...
I mean, I guess when she tells Lillian off at the end, that's about her.
That's true.
But all the events leading up, yeah. All right, well, that's it for this episode of These Books Made Me. Join us next time when we'll discuss a book in which a girl with 2 looped braids comes to America. If you think you know which book we're tackling next, drop us a tweet. We're at PGCMLS on Twitter and hashtag These Books Made Me.